Good day, students. So welcome to today's lesson. We continue with looking at the pillars of sustainable development, and today's focus will be on social equity. So let's begin by defining social equity as best as we possibly can. So social equity can mean very different things to different people. So already we can see here where the whole concept of social equity is actually a very difficult concept to define. But essentially what it is the concept of social equity carries the idea of fairness and justice, and these are based on moral values and consideration. And this is where the problem comes in because moral values can change from one community to another or from one person to another. And of course, these values on both the collective level and individual level can be influenced by the worldviews of both the community or the individual and their experiences, their life experiences. So that is where the challenge really begins. So when it comes to sustainable development and actually defining social equity, we really have to find a way to have some kind of common ground or common understanding. So when we define social equity for the purpose of managing both our national resources and governance, social equity can refer to fairness and just distribution of public services such as health, education, housing, and employment through fair policy and planning measures. So we're talking about the public and the national community having fair and just access to all of these, shall we call them, essential resources that a nation or persons living in a nation will need to have in order to have a reasonable quality of life. And this must be defined at the highest levels. So policy can be defined, and then those policies can be carried out through planning programs. So social equity can also refer to environmental issues as well. So not only public services, but we also want to look at environmental issues in terms of the unequal effects of pollution, climate change, and environmental hazards on the poor. So we have seen, as we've been studying environmental science and environmental management, where typically we find where there, for example, is increased levels of pollution. Even when we look at it within the boundaries of one nation, we can see where there is a clear disparity between the effects on the poor as compared to the middle income and rich sectors of our society. When we look at climate change as well and other environmental hazards, things like flooding, landslides, hurricanes, etc., we find that the poor are disproportionately affected because of, say, for example, where they choose to live, maybe in environmental hazard prone areas, or the quality of housing may make them more vulnerable, etc. So social equity, as we said, is difficult to define. However, it does provide a starting point for researchers from different disciplines to examine what they perceive as unjust or unfair social practices and to come up with options to address them. So social issues, um, they are barely represented in the sustainable development components for Millennium Development Goals. So you'll find that there's no clear section that we would find. However, um, social equity really needs to be integrated throughout all the other areas of focus for sustainable development. And we will, as we move forward into these lessons, we would look at some indicators that can be used to actually measure and observe progress towards social equity. So let us look at social equity in the process of decision making. So this is where it becomes critical to be able to define it. So social equity is inherent in democracy. All right. So of course, where you have different types of governance, whether you're talking socialism, communism, dictatorships, etc., you're less likely to find evidence of social equity occurring at the level of governance, or even evidence through their policies, etc. Um, Socialism maybe a bit more, but it's often very difficult to find true examples of socialism throughout the world. It's a very nice idea and a very nice ideology, but it's often not really truly represented in many parts of the world where it supposedly exists. So social equity, as we said, is really inherent in democracy, where each person has equal ability to influence the decisions of his or her government and makes that his or her government makes, and therefore equal access to the resources required to participate in the political process and to make informed decisions. So, for example, we're talking about the right to vote. You might look at, you know, what are the levels within a particular country in terms of the right to vote? Is it available? First of all, what are the levels of corruption within the electoral process? Um, what are the options for presenting grievances where um, decisions are made and communities or individuals feel disenfranchised? Are there opportunities to go to court and to have your complaints heard and for judgments to possibly be made in your favor? So these are some of the things that we're talking about. Um, Participation on various levels as well. So additionally, as communities grow and evolve, the voices of some groups of residents can sometimes go unheard and consequently unanswered. So that brings us back to the last point we were making. What provisions are in place to facilitate the presentation of grievances? What facilities are in place to allow different groups and different stakeholders to have their voices heard? Is there any form of participatory decision-making process or participatory governance? This is the reason we find in countries like ours in Trinidad and Tobago, if we have large projects that can be developed in a community, the government requires that before approvals can take place, that there must be public consultations. So these are some of the mechanisms that when you're trying to assess social equity, these are some of the things that you might want to be looking for, right? So growth must be managed in order to offset the results of limiting access to resources. All right. So you don't. So the development of your country in all the various forms of development, it must be managed because you do not want to limit or disenfranchise various groups from having access to the resources such as your public services, housing, healthcare, education, and also the impacts of environmental hazards on the poor. So if we use the example of a community project or a project to be developed in a community, if there is risk or chance of environmental hazard in a community, that community must have a voice. They must have a voice if they have concerns that it can negatively affect them. They must have a voice in that decision-making process. Still continuing with decision-making, increasing public participation in the decision-making process improves the gains towards sustainability objectives by addressing the needs of the disenfranchised. So, just as we had been saying, all right, these various groups, the poor, the disabled, the indigenous, these are just some examples of groups that are often disenfranchised in the decision making process. They need to have a voice. They need to have not just a voice, but decisions should be made based on their concerns as well. All right. Um, National and local governments can also play a role towards achieving social equity together with other issues related to sustainable development. So, sustainable development shouldn't only always be about economy, as we would have mentioned before, the environment, or access or availability to health care and all of these things, but we must consider the equity of it. Does every group, every stakeholder have access? What level of access do they have? Are they being barred in any way from having full access? What are the obstacles? All of these things need to be considered for true equity to be present in the process of sustainable development. So the integration of sustainability must be evident in national policies. So at the highest level, we know first will come laws. What laws do we have in place? Then you would have national policies that would be charting the way forward for your country, um, whether it be in terms of industrial development, management of your natural resources. So, you know, we have a multitude of national policies. So, sustainable development or um, sustainability must be evident in the development of those national policies. And again, there should be evidence of some social equity available there. And of course, as we move from the higher national levels to the lower levels where implementation would take place, this is where we need to see evidence within the individual programs or measures being taken place. So these programs should be informed by your national policies. So examples of programs might be things like affordable housing programs, free education, um, public health services, etc. So let us look briefly at some strategies for integrating equity, social equity. So the first one, strategy one, you must be able to define social equity. What does it mean? What does social equity mean to your community, and how is it important? Being able to define social equity helps to mobilize support and resources. So how can you solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is? You need to define it. That's essentially what it means. Okay, for example, if you are able to adequately define social equity in your community, you now know that you need to be able to adequately fund access to food, energy, transportation, economic development. So all of these may have been identified as aspects of social equity where you need to have fair and ready access to all of these things. But if, for example, funding may be limited to make it happen, you know that one of the things you need to do is be able to identify sources of funding to ensure that you can have your community can have fair access to all of these things. Strategy two, we need to be able to integrate social equity into our sustainability plans, as we said before, through an inclusive process. So do our national plans and the programs that come out of it, is there evidence of inclusivity in our sustainability plans? In order to do that, we might want to invite the communities and the various community stakeholders to have input in the planning and decision-making process. And this means that you now give them a voice and you give them a stake in the whatever projects or plans that you intend to put in place. And here now, that means that you can include marginalized members of the community. Strategy 3, collaboration. So it's important to be able to collaborate with other organizations, such as nonprofit organizations, universities, private sector, other local governments. For us, local government we know would be at, let's say, for example, at the municipal corporation level. So you want all of these groups now to be able to work together to achieve common goals. So what are some of the benefits that will come out of it? You will now have the improved capacity to acquire funding, right? So all of these or some or most of these organizations might be in a position to actually contribute to the funding of some of the measures that would need to be put in place to facilitate social equity or evidence of equity in our sustainability planning. These organizations would be able to contribute to an increased capacity for production. So production on all levels, and knowledge sharing, increased knowledge sharing. So expertise, technology, capital or finances, all of these things can be contributed through collaboration. Strategy 4. So we want to set equity goals that specifically address the needs of the marginalized in the community. So these goals are integrated into our policies, as we said, and the programs that flow out of the policies, this is what would be implemented at the community level. For example, we may see community-oriented policing for the purpose of safety. So this safety is a right for all in democracies like ours. Safety is a human right. Availability to local food through the promotion of local farming. So there may be funding that needs to be available to promote the development of local farming. So you're talking about access to food and food security at a local community level now. The farmers may need assistance in terms of the education, in terms of their farming techniques and technologies that are available to them. So these are examples of programs that can be implemented at the community level in order to improve the levels of social equity. So in this case, these examples are in reference to safety and food and education. All right. Setting the goals also ensures that all residents have access to safety for safe and healthy lifestyle choices. Right? For example, if adequate food is available to them, it would not be a matter of that they just have to eat what is available to them. They can actually make choices and make healthy choices that can affect their own long-term health. Okay, strategy 5, the use of data to establish performance measures to track progress. So we're talking about monitoring here. Social equity. Can we identify, first of all, if social equity is evident? And if so, are we moving to higher levels? What kind of progress are we making? And in order to do that, you must have goals, all right? And you must be able to track them. So what exactly are your social equity goals? Remember, we said we start off by firstly defining them, then we have to identify what are our goals. For example, our goals access to food for all, safety for all. These might be some goals. Those are at a very broad level though, all right? And once we've identified those goals, which are associated with social equity, what data will we need to collect in order to measure whether we are achieving social equity or not? All right, so these are our indicators. So let us talk a little bit about social equity indicators. So much of the previous work done in sustainable development has focused on the development, distribution, and maintenance of natural, built, human, financial, and to a lesser extent, social resources, and how to improve well-being over time. But less attention is paid to the role of policies and institutions and to enable these assets to improve quality of life. So what are we really saying? In order to achieve social equity, good, well-designed national policies that integrate indicators and issues of social equity must be developed, and the implementation of those national policies from an institutional level. For example, the agencies will implement the national policies. Um, are they equipped to do it? And if so, what information or what indicators do they need in order to um, measure and assess whether you're on track to achieving social equity in order to improve the quality of life? So essentially, social equity is about the improvement of quality of life for all right? So that's what we're looking at. So this is why it's so important to have indicators as well when we are looking at social equity. So social indicators, we can put them into some broad categories here. So we have social equity themes. There's social justice, which would look at example, equal opportunities for all, equal opportunity for education, safety, healthcare, all of these things, and also the achievement of all human rights. So social equal opportunity to all the basic human rights. All right. Then there is the aspect of solidarity, empathy, cooperation, social relationships. So, for example, we might look at, you know, what, how do our classes, the various income classes, the poor versus the rich, what kind of dynamics do we have existing between them? Do the rich, do the governments, the businessmen, industry, do they see themselves as having any social responsibility to the poor? Um, do we have cooperation taking place between different types of organizations, between education, non-profit organizations, etc.? Is there a willingness to work together for the better good of the broader society? Then there is participation, another theme or category that looks at opportunities for everyone to play a meaningful part in the development. So we looked at some of that before. So in terms of indicators, what indicators can we find or identify where we can determine whether there's evidence and what levels of evidence of whether persons, and particularly the disenfranchised, if they have a role in decision making and development. Then we have security, another theme under social equity. We look at livelihood security, example, access to income that meets basic needs. So we're not talking about being wealthy here. We're just talking about having access to meet basic needs: food, housing, healthcare, education, etc. And also under this category as well is safety from physical threats. All right. How can we measure these things? So hence the reason we talk about indicators. So here we have just a few. I mean, this is by no means an exhaustive list of indicators at social equity indicators. We have in the left column at a national level, and then we have indicators at an international level. Because usually, ideally, what you want to be able to do is measure the national level. And many times what you find is the data collected at the national level would be fed to international organizations that would now collect and collate information from countries around the world to give an international perspective. So if we go back to the national level, let's look briefly at some of the examples that we have here. Number one, we can measure how well the benefits of economic growth have been shared. For example, we can look at children, number of children in low-income households, adults without qualifications, and in workless households. So you don't have the education that would facilitate the income that would come in, how much unemployment you have in the households. Then you're looking at numbers of elderly in fuel poverty. Um, the fuel for cooking, fuel to provide, lighting, etc. And additionally, we know the type of fuel that's being used too, because you have some clean fuel, and then you also have fuel that can lead to air pollution. So these are some interesting indicators that could be looked at. So essentially, you're talking about looking for indicators that would um, focus on what do we call them? The vulnerable populations, children and elderly, as well as the unemployed and uneducated. Then the second point, we can measure human capital. So your human capital, you would look at a national level the numbers of or percentages of your within your productive age group, or your working age group that have qualifications at 19. So at the age of 19, so essentially that is going to be an indication of the percentages of or levels of your population that have probably gone all the way through to secondary school. You might also want to be looking at do they have full certification, five CXCs, including math and English, etc. Um, Human capital, again, you're looking at the expected years of a healthy life. Okay. Social concerns, next point, social concerns related to security and dignity. First point or first indicator, you're looking at proportion of homes judged unfit to live in. So you're talking about housing standards. And I believe there are some international housing standards you would look at where, for example, you'll be looking to see is there running water in the house, indoor sanitation such as flush toilets, is electricity available, etc. These are some of the basic standards you might be looking at. So what levels of those basic standards are met to give you an idea of what percentage still live in poverty. Next point below that, we have the level of crime reported to 1,000 people. So that would be an indicator of safety, physical safety, as a social concern in terms of representing social equity. And then when we look at the international level in our column to the right, at an international level or at a global level, we can look at some indicators such as security of tenure in informal settlements. So we're talking about ownership or security of access to land, particularly as it relates to things like farming, etc. Because this can also not only include housing access and housing safety, but things like food security, etc. So at an international level, they can gather data from across the world in order to have a global assessment as to what is happening across the world by different regions, etc. Similarly, they can look at data from indicators that show access to water and sanitation, as well as participation um, in the decision-making process at the various levels. All right. But as we would have mentioned in earlier lessons, it's very important though that when you want to collect this kind of data, at the national level or the government level is very important for governments to put things in place and for there to be widespread participation across sectors to actually put things in place in order to capture that kind of data to be available for assessment and planning purposes. So we have other types of indicators as well that can be used. There are health indicators where you can look at death rates. That could be data that could be acquired from your local health authorities. Then there's education indicators, as we mentioned before. For example, this one looks at proportion of 16-year-olds with target qualifications that we mentioned before in Trinidad and Tobago. You would expect that most 16, 17-year-olds, should they go all the way through primary to secondary school completion, you're looking to see what percentage of them have that full certificate of 5 CXCs. All right, that would be an indication of access to education and access to that full education. Then you're looking at access to shelter, homelessness. So you're looking for data on homelessness. Again, this is data that could be captured by local authorities, such as regional corporation, local government, etc. What numbers for homelessness do you have for a 6-month period? Because remember, shelter is one of those human rights resources, and it would also give an indication of social equity. Access to services as well. So for example, doctors or medical services, public or private, you're looking to capture that kind of data. Transportation as well, access to shops, purchasing power, etc. And then you would also want to be able to have some indication as well of your levels of effective governance. So for example, we have the Corruption Perception Index, CPI. This indicator, this is an international indicator. It tries rather to reflect the degree of misuse of public power for private benefits. Okay, so we have indicators for effective governance as well. And remember, with regards to social equity, governance is very important. Responsible governance is very important because that is where the process of social equity really begins. Continuing other indicators. So then we have rights and democracy. So we want to be able to measure the extent of participation in the democracy. For example, you could look at proportions of your population with the right to vote, the right to take part or participate in government, freedom of association and assembly. For example, the right, for example, religious faiths to come together safely without persecution, or the right to peacefully protest, things like that. Freedom of opinion and expression. So you're looking at, for example, what is going on in the media. Is there evidence of persecution or censorship? What about with regards to, we have the social media dimension now. Is social media being censored? But at the same time too, we live in a world where total freedom oftentimes can lead to chaos as well. All right, so these are things that we have to bear in mind. Then other indicators, another important one, Human Development Index, HDI. This is a measure of average achievement in key dimensions of human development. So, for example, a long, healthy life. So you're looking at life expectancy at birth. So if you can actually distinguish that information as well, you're not only looking at life expectancy in terms of number of years that a person can live, but how many of those years would be healthy life? All right. Um, for example, you might want to include in that to actually capture a more accurate reflection of it, additional data that might look at, for example, um, NCDs, non-communicable diseases, what levels of NCDs do we have in the country in relation to life expectancy, etc. Second point, being knowledgeable. What numbers of years of schooling for adults age 25 and older? So, for example, you might be looking here to capture information or data with regards to the levels of tertiary education within your population. Um, Third point, you want to have a decent standard of living. So you might be looking at your gross national income per capita, right? So that's your total domestic and foreign output claimed by residents of a country. There's a brief note underneath that clearly distinguishes that from GDP. All right. So I'm going to assume that those of you who would have done Econ 230 already, that might be familiar to you. And then, of course, note as well that Human Development Index does not reflect inequalities, poverty, human security, and empowerment, right? So you're capturing data about these percentages of these different types of information, but it's not really reflecting inequalities within the data. So as mentioned before, you will have policies that need to reflect social equity. These policies, you would also hope to put things in place so that you can capture data as defined by the indicators to understand your national position at a particular point in time and whether you are making progress towards social equity. But we also mention that the implementation of social equity that would be contained, we hope would be contained in your national policies. The implementation of those policies would be the responsibility of agencies. So here we have a few examples of international agencies that would be geared towards various aspects of social equity. All right, that would work in various countries across the world. So, for example, here we have on the left column, we have the name of the international agency, and the right column, a brief description of the function of the agency. But what I did was I just kind of highlighted with key bolded words there for you what the essential focus is. So we have the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, that focuses on poverty, environment, and policies. So building capacity in those areas, and particularly building capacity with regards to policies at country levels. Okay. Then we have UNESCO that focuses on science, education, and training as it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. We have the IMF, focuses on the economy. So they would, with the social equity with regards to economy. All right, to provide, what do we have here? They assist in stabilizing currency exchange rates, providing financing short-term balance of payment deficits for member countries, providing assistance for borrowing, etc. So when countries find themselves in economic straits, like you find many countries across the world during this period, 2020 to 2021, as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, you find that many countries have actually had to go to some of these agencies to help try to balance things out in order to continue to provide some of these basic requirements for the people of their nation, such as food, housing, etc. All right. Then we have the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF. It focuses essentially on children as, as a vulnerable group, where they look at health, education, and safety for the children. And then, of course, we also have World Bank that also, like IMF focuses on economy. Right? So I would expect you all, this is a nice little summary table here. I would expect you all to be able to at least have some idea of what these agencies do as it relates to social equity. So I'd like to thank you for joining me for today's lesson. And I would now like to redirect you to eClassroom for today's activity. Thank you.